The night was cold, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. The road stretched endlessly into the darkness, empty and silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. A sleek black car pulled over to the side, its headlights cutting through the gloom. The engine idled softly as the driver stepped out, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel. He was a man of power, a millionaire who had everything money could buy, luxury cars, sprawling mansions, and a name that commanded respect. But tonight, his hands trembled as he carried a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. The bundle stirred slightly, letting out a faint whimper. The man's heart raced. He glanced around nervously, making sure no one was watching. His mind was a storm of guilt and fear. He couldn't keep the baby. It would ruin him, his reputation, his empire, everything he had worked for. The child was a mistake, a secret that could never see the light of day. He placed the bundle gently on the side of the road, his breath visible in the cold air. For a moment, he hesitated, staring at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. The baby's eyes were closed, its cheeks rosy from the chill. The man's chest tightened, but he pushed the feeling down. He couldn't afford to feel. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "This is the only way." With that, he turned and walked back to the car. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped away, leaving the baby alone in the darkness. Minutes passed. The wind grew colder, and the baby's cries grew louder. Just when it seemed like no one would come, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. An old pickup truck rumbled down the road, its tires kicking up dust. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, slowed down as he spotted the bundle on the side of the road. He pulled over and stepped out, his boots heavy on the gravel. "What in the world?" he muttered, bending down to pick up the baby. The child's cries softened as the man cradled it in his arms, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. Who would do something like this, he wondered aloud, his voice filled with anger and pity. He looked around, but the road was empty. There was no sign of the person who had left the baby here. Shaking his head, the man carried the baby to his truck. "Don't you worry, little one," he said softly. "You're safe now." As the truck drove away, the baby fell asleep, unaware of the life it had just left behind, or the life that awaited it. The farmer's name was Thomas, a simple man with a heart as vast as the fields he tended. He lived alone in a small house at the edge of a quiet village, surrounded by rolling hills and endless skies. Life had been lonely since his wife passed away years ago, but he had learned to find peace in the rhythm of his daily chores, feeding the chickens, tending to the crops, and watching the sun rise and set. That night, when he found the baby on the side of the road, something inside him shifted. He didn't know why the child had been abandoned, and he didn't care. All he knew was that this little one needed love, and he had plenty to give. Thomas brought the baby home and named him Leo, after the constellation he often admired in the night sky. "You're my little star now," he said, rocking the baby to sleep in his arms. As the years passed, Leo grew into a bright and curious boy. He had Thomas's kind eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest room. The two of them became inseparable. Thomas taught Leo how to plant seeds, milk cows, and fix broken fences. In return, Leo brought a sense of joy and purpose to Thomas's life that he hadn't felt in years. But despite the happiness they shared, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was missing Leo. He often wondered about the baby's parents, who they were, why they had left him, and whether they ever thought about him. Still, he never brought it up with Leo. The boy was happy, and that was all that mattered. Meanwhile, far away in the city, the millionaire who had abandoned Leo was living a very different life. His name was Victor, and he had once been one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the country. But over the years, his empire had begun to crumble. Victor's downfall started with a series of bad investments. Then came the scandals, corruption, fraud, and unethical business practices that made headlines across the nation. His reputation was ruined, and his fortune dwindled. His wife left him, taking their 2 children with her. Alone and broken, Victor found himself haunted by the memory of the baby he had left on the road all those years ago. One night, as he sat in his empty mansion, staring at the walls that once echoed with laughter, Victor made a decision. He would find his son. It was the only thing he had left to live for. The next morning, Victor packed a bag and set out on a journey to the place where he had abandoned the baby. He didn't know what he would find, but he was determined to make things right, or at least try. Back in the village, Leo was now a teenager, full of energy and dreams. He loved helping Thomas on the farm, but he often wondered what lay beyond the hills. "Do you think I'll ever see the world, Thomas?" he asked one evening as they sat by the fireplace. Thomas smiled, his eyes twinkling with pride. "Of course you will, Leo. The world is big, and it's waiting for someone like you to make a mark." Little did they know, the world was about to come knocking on their door. One afternoon, as Leo was tending to the chickens, he noticed a strange car driving down the dirt road that led to their farm. It was sleek and expensive, completely out of place in their quiet village. The car stopped near the house, and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a fine suit, but his face was lined with worry and regret. Leo watched from a distance as the man approached Thomas, who was fixing a broken fence. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm looking for someone. A child, a baby who was left on this road many years ago." Thomas froze, his heart pounding. He looked at the man, then at Leo, who was now walking toward them. For the first time in years, Thomas felt a surge of fear. He had always known this day might come, but he wasn't ready for it. "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice steady but firm. The man hesitated, his eyes filled with guilt and desperation. "My name is Victor," he said. "And I think that boy might be my son." Victor's life had been a whirlwind of luxury and power, but now it felt like a never-ending storm. The once great millionaire sat in his dimly lit study, surrounded by the remnants of his former glory, expensive paintings, polished furniture, and shelves lined with trophies and awards. But none of it brought him comfort. The room felt empty, just like his heart. It had been years since he abandoned his baby on that deserted road. At the time, he had convinced himself it was the only way to protect his empire. But now, as he stared at the cracked mirror across the room, he saw a man he barely recognized. His hair was graying, his face lined with regret, and his eyes hollow from years of guilt. Victor's downfall had been swift and brutal. His business partners turned against him, his friends disappeared, and the media painted him as a villain. The empire he had built with sweat and ambition crumbled like a house of cards. He lost everything, his wealth, his family, and his self-respect. The final blow came when his wife left him. She had stood by him through thick and thin, but even she couldn't ignore the darkness that had consumed him. "You've changed, Victor," she had said, her voice trembling with sadness. "The man I married is gone." She took their 2 children and moved to another city, leaving Victor alone in the mansion that now felt more like a prison. One night, as he sat in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey, Victor's thoughts drifted to the baby he had abandoned. He had tried to bury the memory, but it always resurfaced, especially in his weakest moments. He wondered if the child was still alive, if someone had found him, if he was happy. The guilt was unbearable. Victor had spent his life chasing success, but now he realized that the only thing that truly mattered was the family he had lost. He had abandoned his own flesh and blood, and the weight of that decision was crushing him. "I have to find him," Victor whispered to himself, his voice breaking. "I have to make things right." The next morning, Victor packed a bag and set out on a journey to the place where he had left the baby. He didn't know what he would find, but he was determined to face his past, no matter how painful it might be. The drive to the village was long and lonely. Victor's mind raced with questions and doubts. What if the child was no longer alive? What if he had been adopted by a loving family? What if he hated Victor for what he had done? When Victor finally arrived at the village, he was struck by its simplicity. The air was fresh, the fields were green, and the people seemed content with their quiet lives. It was a world away from the chaos of the city, and for a moment, Victor felt a sense of peace. But that peace was short-lived. As he drove down the dirt road, he spotted a small farmhouse in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. Could this be the place? Victor parked his car and stepped out, his legs trembling with nervousness. He saw an older man fixing a fence nearby and approached him cautiously. "Excuse me," Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm looking for someone. A child, a baby who was left on this road many years ago." The man, Thomas, looked up, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with tension. "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice steady but firm. Victor hesitated, his heart pounding. He knew this was the moment of truth. "My name is Victor," he said, his voice trembling. "And I think that boy might be my son." Thomas's face hardened. He glanced at Leo, who was now walking toward them, his curiosity evident. For years, Thomas had dreaded this moment, but now that it was here, he knew he had to face it. "Leo," Thomas called out, his voice calm but serious. "Come here, son." Leo approached, his eyes darting between Thomas and the stranger. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. Victor's breath caught in his throat as he looked at Leo. The boy was the spitting image of his younger self, the same eyes, the same smile. There was no doubt in Victor's mind. This was his son. But before Victor could say anything, Thomas stepped forward, shielding Leo with his body. "You need to leave," he said, his voice firm. "You don't belong here." Victor's heart sank. He had expected anger, but he hadn't expected to be turned away so quickly. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. "I just want to talk to him. I need to explain." Thomas shook his head. "You had your chance years ago. You don't get to waltz back into his life now." Leo looked at Thomas, then at Victor, his confusion turning to suspicion. "What's he talking about, Thomas?" he asked. "Who is this guy?" Thomas hesitated, his heart aching. He had always known this day would come, but he wasn't ready to let Leo go. "I'll explain everything later," he said, his voice softening. "But for now, go inside." Leo nodded reluctantly and walked back to the house, casting one last glance at Victor before disappearing inside. Victor watched him go, his heart heavy with regret. He had come so far, only to be shut out. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Victor stood frozen in place, his eyes fixed on the farmhouse where Leo had disappeared. His heart ached with a mix of regret and longing. He had come so far, only to be met with resistance. But he couldn't give up now. Not when he was this close. Thomas crossed his arms, his expression stern. "You need to leave," he repeated, his voice firm. "Leo doesn't need you in his life. He's happy here." Victor took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I know I don't deserve a second chance," he said, his voice trembling. "But I've changed. I just want to make things right." Thomas shook his head. "You don't get to decide what's right for him. You lost that right the moment you left him on the side of the road." The words stung, but Victor knew they were true. He had made a terrible mistake, and now he was paying the price. Still, he couldn't walk away. Not yet. "Please," Victor pleaded, his voice breaking. "Just let me talk to him. Let me explain. If he decides he doesn't want anything to do with me, I'll leave and never come back. But he deserves to know the truth. Thomas hesitated, his resolve wavering. He had always known this day might come, but he had hoped it never would. Leo was his son in every way that mattered, and the thought of losing him was unbearable. But deep down, Thomas knew Victor was right. Leo deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Fine, Thomas said finally, his voice heavy with reluctance. But I'll be there when you talk to him. And if you hurt him in any way, I'll make sure you regret it. Victor nodded, relief washing over him. Thank you, he said softly. I won't let you down. The two men walked to the farmhouse in silence, the tension between them palpable. When they entered, Leo was sitting at the kitchen table, his brow furrowed with confusion. What's going on? Leo asked, looking from Thomas to Victor. Who is this guy, and why is he here? Thomas took a deep breath, his heart aching. Leo, there's something you need to know, he said, his voice gentle but serious. This man, his name is Victor. And he's your father. Leo's eyes widened in shock. He looked at Victor, then back at Thomas, his mind racing. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice trembling. You're my father. Thomas shook his head, his eyes filled with sadness. I've raised you as my own, and I'll always be your dad in my heart. But the truth is, you were abandoned as a baby. I found you on the side of the road and took you in. Victor here, he's your biological father. Leo stared at Thomas, his world spinning. He had always known he was adopted, but he had never imagined his real father would show up out of nowhere. He turned to Victor, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and confusion. Is this true? Leo asked, his voice shaking. Did you really abandon me? Victor's heart broke at the pain in Leo's voice. He nodded, his eyes filled with regret. It's true, he said softly. I made a terrible mistake, and I've regretted it every day since. I'm so sorry, Leo. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know the truth. Leo stood up, his fists clenched. You left me on the side of the road like I was nothing, he said, his voice rising. Do you have any idea what that does to someone? Do you even care? Victor flinched at the anger in Leo's voice, but he didn't look away. I care more than you can imagine, he said, his voice breaking. I've spent years trying to forget what I did, but I can't. I've lost everything because of my mistakes, and the only thing I have left is the hope that maybe, just maybe, I can make things right with you. Leo shook his head, tears streaming down his face. You can't just show up after all these years and expect me to forgive you, he said, his voice trembling. You don't get to do that. Victor nodded, his heart heavy with guilt. I understand, he said softly. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. If you ever want to talk, I'll be here. With that, Victor turned and walked out of the farmhouse, leaving Leo and Thomas alone. The room was silent except for the sound of Leo's quiet sobs. Thomas stepped forward and pulled Leo into a tight hug. I'm so sorry, son, he said, his voice filled with emotion. I never wanted you to go through this. Leo clung to Thomas, his heart aching. I don't know what to do, he whispered. I don't know how to feel. Thomas stroked Leo's hair, his own eyes filled with tears. You don't have to figure it out right now, he said gently. Take your time. I'll be here for you, no matter what. The days that followed Victor's visit were a whirlwind of emotions for Leo. He couldn't stop thinking about the man who had abandoned him, the man who claimed to be his father. Part of him wanted to hate Victor, to shut him out completely. But another part of him was curious. Who was this man? Why had he left? And why had he come back now? Leo spent hours talking to Thomas, trying to make sense of everything. Thomas did his best to comfort him, but even he couldn't answer all of Leo's questions. "I don't know why he did what he did," Thomas admitted one evening as they sat by the fireplace. "But I do know this, you're strong, Leo. Stronger than you realize. Whatever you decide to do, I'll support you." Leo nodded, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't avoid Victor forever. Sooner or later, he would have to face him. One afternoon, as Leo was working in the fields, he saw Victor's car parked near the farmhouse. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen Victor since their confrontation, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face him again. But he knew he couldn't put it off any longer. Leo took a deep breath and walked toward the house. When he entered, he found Victor sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard Leo come in, his eyes filled with hope and fear. "Leo," Victor said, his voice trembling. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me." Leo crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "I'm still not sure," he admitted. "But I have questions. And I need answers." Victor nodded, his heart pounding. "Of course," he said softly. "Ask me anything." Leo sat down across from Victor, his eyes locked on the man who had abandoned him. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Victor took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "I was young and selfish," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought I had everything, money, power, success. But when I found out about you, I panicked. I was afraid of what people would think, of how it would affect my reputation. So I made the worst decision of my life. I left you on that road, hoping someone would find you and give you a better life than I could." Leo's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. "Do you have any idea what that did to me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Do you know how it feels to grow up knowing you were abandoned?" Victor's heart ached at the pain in Leo's voice. "I can't imagine," he said softly. "And I'll never forgive myself for what I did. But I want you to know that I've changed. Losing everything, my wealth, my family, my reputation, it made me realize what truly matters. And what matters most to me now is you." Leo shook his head, his emotions swirling. "You can't just show up after all these years and expect me to believe you," he said, his voice trembling. "How do I know you're not just here because you have nothing left?" Victor looked down, his eyes filled with shame. "You don't," he admitted. "And I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm serious. I want to be a part of your life, Leo. Not because I have to, but because I want to." Leo stared at Victor, his heart torn. Part of him wanted to believe him, to give him a chance. But another part of him was afraid of being hurt again, afraid of losing the only family he had ever known. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Leo said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "But I'm willing to try. On one condition." Victor's eyes lit up with hope. "Anything," he said eagerly. Leo took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "You have to earn my trust," he said. "No more lies, no more secrets. If you want to be a part of my life, you have to prove that you're serious." Victor nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I will," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'll do whatever it takes." For the first time since Victor had arrived, Leo felt a glimmer of hope. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't alone anymore. The days that followed were tense but hopeful. Victor stayed in the village, renting a small room at the local inn. He spent his days helping Thomas around the farm, doing whatever he could to prove his sincerity. At first, Leo kept his distance, watching Victor from afar. But slowly, he began to open up, allowing himself to get to know the man who had abandoned him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Leo found himself sitting on the porch with Victor. The air was cool, and the sky was painted with shades of orange and pink. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Finally, Leo broke the silence. "Why now?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with curiosity. "Why did you wait so long to come find me?" Victor sighed, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I wanted to come sooner," he admitted. "But I was afraid. Afraid of what you'd think of me, afraid of being rejected. It wasn't until I lost everything that I realized I had nothing left to lose." Leo nodded, his heart aching. He could see the pain in Victor's eyes, and for the first time, he felt a glimmer of empathy. "What happened to you?" he asked. "How did you lose everything?" Victor hesitated, his hands trembling. "I made a lot of mistakes," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I was greedy, selfish, and arrogant. I thought I could get away with anything because I had money and power. But in the end, it all came crashing down. My business partners turned against me, my wife left me, and I lost everything, my wealth, my reputation, even my self-respect." Leo listened quietly, his heart breaking for the man sitting beside him. He had spent so long hating Victor, but now he realized that Victor had been suffering too. "I don't expect you to feel sorry for me," Victor said, his voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve your sympathy. But I want you to know that I've changed. Losing everything made me realize what truly matters: family, love, and forgiveness. And the only thing I want now is to make things right with you." Leo looked at Victor, his eyes filled with emotion. "It's not going to be easy," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I've spent my whole life wondering why you left me, and it's going to take time for me to trust you." Victor nodded, his heart swelling with hope. "I understand," he said softly. "And I'm willing to wait. I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust, Leo. I just want a chance to be your father." Leo's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. "I don't know if I can call you that," he admitted. "But I'm willing to try." For the first time in years, Victor felt a sense of peace. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. Victor's presence in the village became a quiet but steady force. He didn't push Leo for more than the boy was willing to give, and he didn't try to replace Thomas in any way. Instead, he focused on showing Leo, through his actions, that he was serious about making amends. He helped Thomas repair the old barn, his hands blistered and sore from the unfamiliar labor. He woke up at dawn to feed the animals and spent hours in the fields, learning how to plant and harvest crops. At first, the villagers were wary of the wealthy stranger who had suddenly appeared in their midst, but over time, they began to accept him. They saw how hard he worked and how much he cared for Leo. For Leo, watching Victor's transformation was both confusing and inspiring. He had spent so long resenting the man who had abandoned him, but now he saw a different side of Victor, a side that was humble, determined, and willing to change. One afternoon, as Leo and Victor were repairing a fence together, Leo finally broke the silence that had been hanging between them. "Why are you doing all this?" Leo asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. "You don't have to work so hard. You could just, I don't know, buy your way back into my life." Victor paused, wiping the sweat from his brow. He looked at Leo, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I could," he admitted. "But that's not what I want. I don't want to buy your forgiveness, Leo. I want to earn it. I want to show you that I'm willing to put in the effort, even if it's hard." Leo nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions. He had spent so long questioning Victor's motives, but now he was starting to believe that the man truly wanted to change. "It's not going to be easy," Leo said, his voice quiet but firm. "I still don't know if I can forgive you." Victor smiled, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know," he said softly. "And I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I'm willing to wait, no matter how long it takes." As the weeks turned into months, Victor became a familiar presence in Leo's life. He didn't try to force a relationship, but he was always there when Leo needed him, whether it was to help with a difficult task or simply to listen. Slowly but surely, the walls Leo had built around his heart began to crumble. One evening, as the three of them, Leo, Thomas, and Victor, sat around the fireplace, Leo finally asked the question that had been weighing on his mind. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Where do we go from here?" Thomas and Victor exchanged a glance, their expressions filled with emotion. "That's up to you, Leo," Thomas said gently. "This is your life, and you get to decide how you want to live it." Victor nodded, his eyes filled with hope. "Whatever you decide, I'll respect it," he said softly. "I just want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what." Leo looked at the two men who had shaped his life in such different ways. Thomas, who had raised him with love and kindness, and Victor, who had abandoned him but was now trying to make amends. For the first time, Leo felt a sense of peace. I think I want to give this a chance," Leo said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know what the future holds, but I'm willing to try." Victor's eyes filled with tears, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Leo," he said, his voice breaking. "You won't regret it." Thomas reached over and squeezed Leo's hand, his eyes filled with pride. "I'm proud of you, son," he said softly. "No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." Years passed, and life in the village settled into a new rhythm. Victor became a permanent part of Leo's life, not as a replacement for Thomas, but as an addition to the family Leo had always known. The three of them worked together on the farm, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Leo had grown into a young man, full of dreams and ambitions. He had decided to stay in the village, not out of obligation, but because he loved the simplicity and peace it offered. He had also started a small business, selling organic produce from the farm to nearby towns. It was a modest venture, but it was his, and he was proud of it. Victor, too, had found a sense of purpose. He had left behind his old life of wealth and power, choosing instead to live a quiet, humble existence. He had become a mentor to the young people in the village, teaching them about business and finance. But more importantly, he had become a father to Leo, a role he cherished more than anything. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields, Victor turned to Leo with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," Victor said, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "I want to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." Leo looked at him, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Victor took a deep breath, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I'm proud of you, Leo," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Not because of what you've achieved, but because of the person you've become. You're kind, hardworking, and compassionate, everything I never was. And I want you to know that I'm grateful to be a part of your life." Leo's eyes filled with tears, his heart swelling with emotion. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "That means a lot to me." Thomas smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "He's right, you know," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've grown into an amazing young man, Leo. And I'm proud to call you my son." For a moment, the three of them sat in silence, their hearts filled with love and gratitude. It had been a long and difficult journey, but they had come out stronger on the other side. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Leo felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He had spent so much of his life questioning his past, but now he realized that it didn't define him. What mattered was the present, the love and support of the people who had chosen to be his family. "I've learned something important," Leo said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "No matter where we come from or what mistakes we've made, we all deserve a second chance. And sometimes, forgiveness is the greatest gift we can give, not just to others, but to ourselves." Victor and Thomas nodded, their eyes filled with understanding. They had all made mistakes, but they had also found redemption, in each other, and in themselves. Epilogue. Years later, Leo stood at the edge of the fields, watching as the sun rose over the horizon. The farm had grown, and so had his family. He had married a kind and loving woman, and together they had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Victor and Thomas were still a big part of his life, their bond stronger than ever. They had become grandfathers to Leo's children, spoiling them with love and attention. As Leo looked out over the fields, his heart filled with gratitude. He had come a long way from the abandoned baby on the side of the road. He had found love, forgiveness, and a sense of purpose. And as he watched his children run through the fields, their laughter echoing in the morning air, Leo knew that he had everything he had ever wanted. The story of Leo, Victor, and Thomas is a reminder that no matter how far we fall, we can always rise again. It's a story of forgiveness, redemption, and the power of second chances. We all make mistakes, but it's never too late to make things right. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can give, to others and to ourselves, is the gift of forgiveness. So, if you're holding on to anger or regret, let it go. Give yourself a second chance. And remember, no matter where you come from or what you've been through, you have the power to create a brighter future. Because in the end, it's not about the mistakes we've made, it's about the lessons we've learned, and the love we've shared along the way.